In the western part of Luxor, in ancient Thebes, stands the funerary temple of one of the greatest Egyptian pharaohs, Ramses II. This huge architectural complex spans over 5 hectares. Its construction dates back to 1277 BC. This edifice, the Ramesseum, was a major religious and economic complex. It displays important remains, such as monumental gates, pylons, paintings, giant statues, and low reliefs, as well as adobe brick annexes and a sanctuary. Since 1991, Christian Leblanc, Egyptologist at the CNRS and director of the Association for the Safekeeping of the Ramesseum, has led the archaeological digs and restoration works on this site. These new excavations will help to illustrate what the site looked like over 2,000 years ago, and future missions will expand on this work. Ancient Egypt has always fascinated archaeologists. With 3,000 years of history and a succession of some 300 pharaohs and 300 dynasties, Egypt is full of ancient treasures. Napoleon was the first to manifest interest in Egyptology during his expedition to Egypt. Then some Western countries, such as Germany and Great Britain, also became interested in Egypt's past, but no major excavation works were really led. They were primarily interested in the hidden treasures of Egyptian pharaohs. But little by little throughout the 20th century, thanks to scientific research, the society, religion, economy, and history of ancient Egypt was reconstituted, and the blank periods of history were filled in. Egyptology has enabled the Egyptian people to reclaim their historical identity and has revealed the splendor of its culture. The French Institute of Eastern Archaeology has trained a great number of Egyptologists, archaeologists, and philologists. Starting with Gaston Maspero, the French archaeological presence in Egypt has grown and evolved. It expanded during the following decades, since for a very long time the sector of Egyptian antiquities was led by French experts. And this was maintained until the Egyptian Revolution led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. The French were present, as were the British, the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish, the Russians, and the Americans. There's a wide range of nationalities working in Egyptological research on site in Egypt. Due to its shared history with Egypt, France is very involved in this country, as is Germany. It is worth noting that these two countries are certainly the most involved in archaeological research, because this tradition first existed in France and Germany. We are indeed the heirs of Champollion and Lepsius. I believe this explains why France and Germany are still very present in Egypt within archaeological and Egyptological research. For all these reasons, we are still very present in this domain. The first excavators who came to work on the Ramesseum scoured the site and then explored many tombs. They were specifically looking for objects and funerary furnishings to enrich foreign museums. Things started to change in 1900 to 1906. During this period, Howard Carter was Inspector-in-Chief of Antiquities in Thebes. Howard Carter, who would later discover the tomb of Tutankhamun. Howard Carter wanted the Ramesseum to be cleaned, so the temple was cleaned and cleared. But it was only cleaned. There were no digs or excavations. All the rubble which had been inside the monument was removed and taken outside. This work was undertaken by Émile Varèse, the French architect of antiquities. Émile Varèse was charged with removing the rubble and using it to create these kinds of immense ramparts around the Ramesseum. At the time, this was very interesting, since it was one of the first attempts to highlight an archaeological site. Tourists could ascend the rubble and take in a panoramic view of the temple. The Ramesseum was otherwise left alone for a very long time. It was not at all the subject of archaeological research. It is only in the 1970s that research teams started becoming interested in the Ramesseum and began establishing archaeological surveys. All of this followed in the steps of past explorers and travelers, like the expeditions led by Bonaparte, Champollion, Rosellini, and Lepsius. All these people came to the Ramesseum. They made observations, but the true excavations started taking place in 1896. It must be noted that at this time, scientific research was primarily concerned with the discovery of beautiful objects. Of course, following this period, the first surveys did not occur until the 1970s. But priority was given to other Theban monuments, and the Ramesseum was again left aside for a long time. It is only around 1989-1990 that the monument became the subject of active research. And this time, the research was thoroughly systematic. That means that the monument was conceded and then underwent archaeological surveys in an attempt to explore it entirely, systematically, scanning the site piece by piece, establishing an archaeological and architectural survey for the totality of the monument. This work began some 20 years ago, and it is far from being completed, even though much work has already been done on this edifice, through archaeological excavations and architectural, iconographic, and epigraphic surveys. There were also major works concerning its restoration, conservation, protection, and development, because today, when we survey an archaeological site, we keep in these aspects in mind. They're absolutely complementary and necessary to the enhancement of a site. The first description that we have of this monument we owe to the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus. While traveling through Egypt in the 1st century BC, he stopped in Thebes and visited what he then called the tomb of Ozymandias. The tomb of Ozymandias is none other than the Ramesseum itself, which is unfortunately dismantled today. At the time when Diodorus visited this monument, it was still in large part intact. His description gives us an idea of what this foundation was like at the height of its glory. The first pylon was located here. There was a first courtyard with porticos. He described the colors of this portico and the Assyrian figures that decorated the northern side. In this first courtyard, there were giant, majestic colossi. He described the Colossus of Ozymandias, that is Ramses II. This Colossus represented the divine kingship. He also reported on a monumental statue of the king's mother, Queen Tui. This colossus disappeared for a very long time. It was forgotten, completely ignored, and very often those translating Diodorus Siculus doubted his reportings and believed he had perhaps made up the tomb of Ozymandias. But today, we know that he was correct, because so many colossi of the queen have been found. The pieces of this sculpture here, a month ago, they were all on the ground. The same is true of all the pieces of the Colossus that you see here next to it. All of this was in front, and we had to organize all of this. We organized it elsewhere on another site. I'm happy to have done it, because when we first arrived, we did not know how many colossi there were. Now at least, there will be a perfect understanding, and this was the mission director's specific goal, to have a good understanding of what this colossus was, here in this spot, and of the other one beside it. It is interesting to see that the translators of Diodorus Siculus, including especially the Hellenists who had studied the question of the famed tomb of Ozymandias, tried to understand what Diodorus tried to say about this exceptional monument. The Hellenists asked themselves these questions. Of course, when you're at the Ramesseum, you see this enormous colossus of Ramses II. But in the end, we see very little. There's practically nothing which remains of his mother. Did Diodorus tell the truth? Was it his imagination? Did he make it up? Finally, we realized that this colossus did truly exist. And this led us to piece it together according to the fragments found on site. This work was led by Daniel Essoin this year, and it allows us to see Queen Tuyi, that is, the mother of Ramses II, reappear in the context of the first courtyard. In the end, I believe that in reconstituting the statue, even if only partially, the queen reclaims her dignity in her son's temple. It also pays tribute to Diodorus Siculus in affirming that he was correct, that his writings were not fabulated, that Queen Tuyi was indeed the mother of Ramses II in the first courtyard's complex. We faced some difficulties, like adapting the piece of elbow which was just hanging there, but luckily we realized that all the pieces fit together. This means that the part that was delaminated here has not moved since antiquity, since the time when it was cut off. It also helps to understand how they cut this up, and this made the reconstruction easier. Now we are sure that we have left nothing to chance interpretation. There were enough elements for us to establish this, both on the sandstone pedestal and on the granite piece. We are certain that we're not mistaken. While we were reassembling the sculpture with Christian Leblanc, we put many things into question. It is a collective work because there's the sculptor on the one hand and the researcher on the other. We realized that there were other characters on the sides, and this we had not noticed at first. Once the sculpture was reassembled, we did what we call an anastylosis. That is to say, it is impossible to wholly reconstruct the statue in its entirety, since we only have half of it, or 3/4. But to consolidate it for the pieces to hold, I had to build a support behind or beside the sculpture. So these pieces here, they are made of sandstone. And here, my job is to remodel all the missing parts in such a way as to distinguish the restored part and the ancient part. This requires us to work as if we were in their own time, because even though we may speak of symmetry, nothing is symmetrical. We are in a context of restoration. Thus we do not build, we have to measure and maintain this osmosis between the two. All of the fragments were on the site. This means that when the images of Ramses II and Tuyi were destroyed, the motivation was not economic. They did not take the stones or carry them to another site to reuse them. No, the fragments were here. As we progressed in the investigation, bit by bit, we also realized that the statue of Ramses II itself had been severely damaged. First and foremost, his facial features had practically been erased. So the goal was to destroy the king's body. Also, a large slit across the forehead proved to be an intentional cut. This shows that the pieces were first cut off, then demolished. So this raised questions regarding history. At what time did men come to the Ramesseum to attack these monumental images? While continuing this investigation, we arrived at the conclusion that these two images were destroyed in Christian times. We do have elements that enable us to reassemble it, and thus to complete it. Once the pedestal is complete, we'll be able to reinstall the feet of Ramses II on this pedestal. They're not in their right spot today. Of course, these colossi must be studied. What did they represent? What did they truly represent for the ancient Egyptians? We know that the image of Ramses II was a divine representation of Ramses II. In fact, the colossus had a name. It was called Son of Princes, Re-Enakaos. That was the name given to this colossus. It was an object of worship, thus a godlike representation, or a godlike facet of Ramses II within the context of his palace. We have found remains of this religious edifice, including small columns whose foundations are still in place. All of this will enable us to better understand how everything fit together at the time of Ramses II. And we know that these colossi had their own clergy. They all had a clergy that was at their disposal, taking care of the liturgies, the worship, everything. We also know that the royal colossi held private property. They sometimes owned vineyards and olive groves. In the case of the Colossus of Ramses II, which is here, we know that the oil produced from the olive groves on the delta belonged precisely to the estate of Re-Enakaou. That means that the olive oil produced on the estate of Re-Enakaou converged to the Ramesseum. This can seem peculiar to us, because we have a hard time imagining statues as owners of private property, of farming land, vineyards, and olive groves. Yet this was the case, and not only for this colossus, but for many others as well, those of Ramses II and those of other pharaohs. We have here divine forms representing different facets of the reigning king, who was of course worshipped. We have the human facet of the king, as a sovereign reigning over Egypt, trying to do well by his population, handling administrative and current affairs, handling conflicts and wars when they erupted. Beside this, there were other facets of the king beneath these granite stones. It's worth noting that this colossus came from the quarries of Aswan and weighed nearly 1,000 tons. Can you imagine how this colossus arrived to the Ramesseum? Once it was extracted from the quarries of Aswan, it was most probably transported on the Nile. To reach Thebes, it had to be transported 200 kilometers. Can you imagine the scene of jubilation there must have been on the banks of the river when the people saw this colossus progressing towards the site where it was to be established? Clearly, these monuments are very important within the context of the temple, and they enable us to understand one of the aspects of royal worship, especially as it stood at the time of Ramses. This worship revolved around the petrified images of the king that at the time were colossi, statues that bore very specific names. The uncovered part of the Ramesseum, the great temple of Ramses II, today spans 10 hectares, and this does not include everything which stands before this first pylon. For example, in front of this first pylon, there was a parvis, a monumental gate, and portuary constructions. Although this surface is quite large, only half of it has been systematically explored for the time being. So a lot of work awaits future generations of archaeologists and Egyptologists. We're inside an edifice that was made entirely of stone. There was a complex of annexes and vaulted buildings made of adobe brick. A number of vaults in situ can still be seen today. These are the most ancient vault remains in all of history. These vaulted buildings that surrounded the temple on 3 of its sides housed administrative, economic, and socio-cultural services. They stood in relation to the priests who managed this foundation. A monumental staircase in the first courtyard gave access to a second courtyard, which was a peristyle courtyard. And again, there are siren pillars representing the king in mummiform fashion, wrapped up in a kind of sheath. There too, there were statues. We know that in the second courtyard there were 2 statues of the king flanking the staircase that led to the temple's great hypostyle hall. Ramses II was a major figure of the empire. He was a great king, a great pharaoh of the new empire in the 13th century BC. His reign lasted 67 years and was one of the longest reigns. He ascended the throne when he was still quite young. His father was Seti I. His mother was Tui. His father most likely associated him to the throne and bestowed upon him the rudiments of governance before passing away. When Ramses became pharaoh, he was between 22 and 25 years old. So he was a young king. A young king who was full of ambition, because as we know, Ramses II devoted a lot to constructions. He left his cartouches on nearly all the sites of Egypt, from the Delta to Nubia and even beyond. He was a builder, but also and especially a warrior king. In the 5th year of his reign, he began a military campaign that led him to the Hittite Empire. There he encountered federal forces and engaged in a difficult battle in which he was defeated. The famous Battle of Kadesh. And yet, he continued leading other primitive expeditions until the 20th year of his reign. These expeditions enabled him to better redefine the borders of his territory. Egypt during his time was still quite vast and had important trade relations with foreign lands. But Egypt had to call on a foreign workforce because the wars brought foreign prisoners to Egypt. These prisoners worked in the quarries. During the time of Ramses II, various communities lived in Egypt, and some of these became rooted here through regrouped families. It is interesting to see how these communities became integrated in Egypt at the time of Ramses II. In fact, we know that some of the state servants working for Ramses II were of foreign background. Ramses II surrounded himself with brilliant figures. Most of the king's higher-ranking state servants were of utmost quality, like his brother-in-law Tuya, who was one of the temple's administrators at the beginning of the king's reign. The Ramesseum underwent construction at the beginning of the king's reign. It's an extraordinary work, a personal undertaking aimed at glorifying his reign. Many different administrators followed and worked in this monument. They were high-ranking servants to the king. Ramses II was later rediscovered when the profaners reached his sepulchres. During the 21st dynasty, the priests carried all these royal mummies to a hiding spot, the famous site of Devalderé, in which many pharaonic mummies of the Ramesside period were found, including the mummy of Ramses II, which is today at the Museum of Cairo. This mummy was treated in France in 1976 because mushrooms had begun attacking it. De champignons qui avaient commencé à attaquer la momie. Donc il y a eu un accord qui a été passé à cette époque. At that time, an agreement had been made between Egyptian President Anwar el-Sadat and French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. The mummy was sent to France to be treated for 6 months and was returned to Egypt in prime condition. This mummy taught us a lot through the analysis it underwent. It gave us more precise information on the death of Ramses II and on the period when he died. We know that the king's reign lasted 67 years. If he ascended the throne at 22, 25 years old, he must have died around the age of 90. This is truly exceptional for ancient Egypt, since the mortality rate was close to 40 to 50 years old. A man who lived until the age of 90 was truly surprising. There's the architecture and also the iconography. The murals on the walls depict different themes, and it is interesting that these themes bear relation to the length of his reign. What we see spread out on these walls is royal propaganda. They usually revolve around 4 major themes, including a military theme depicting the pharaoh at war, showing the battles he led in foreign lands. The Ramesseum illustrates the great battle of Kadesh that took place in the 5th year of the reign against the Hittite Confederation. Sometimes other military themes are represented, such as the famous battle led in the 8th year against the cities of Tunip and Dapur in modern-day Syria. It's true that Ramses II figures in the iconography and even in the famous poem of Pentuer. It seems that Ramses II was an exceptional figure in the context of this battle. He is characterized as something of a hero, and yet we know that the citadel of Kadesh was never seized by Egypt. The battle that took place left many dead and wounded. Then at some point, talks took place between the Hittite leader and Ramses II, and a kind of armistice was established. The Egyptian forces returned to Egypt, and the Hittite people were left in peace. But this does not mean that the war was over and done with. There were many disputes throughout the following years, especially concerning borders. That is why Ramses II again went to war, leading primitive expeditions to a number of cities bordering the territory acquired by Egypt. And very often, because these citadels had been placed under Hittite tutelage, the goal was to bring them back under Egyptian influence. By the 21st year, the borders of Egypt and of the Hittite Empire seem to have been re-established and mapped. This led to the creation of a peace treaty. The peace treaty signed in the 21st year of the reign between Ramses II and Hattusili III is very interesting because it includes different articles. If we look closely, we see that the two empires wished to collaborate not only within the context of trade relations, but also on a fraternal level. That means that if Egypt were to be attacked by a foreign population, the Hittites would aid Egypt. So we can plainly see that this is a peace treaty, and it is the first known peace treaty in history. For the time being, it is the first documented peace treaty. Maybe there were others prior to it, but in any case, it is the only one that is documented today. This peace treaty is important because it is documented both in Egyptian, in hieroglyphs, and in Akkadian. These are the two versions of the peace treaty. There's another more political theme. The walls we see here, for example, depict the king being led by two of the kingdom's god, Mortuary and Atum. They are shown advancing towards a group of gods and divinities seated on throne, Amon, Montu, et Khonsu. And here the king appears within a sequence of royal crownings. At this time, Ramses II is indeed recognized as pharaoh by the god of Thebes. This wall here depicts another theme that is often found within the context of the temple. It is the royal ascent, the crowning of the god by the god Amon himself, and the inscription of the deed by Thoth, the divine arbitrator. This sequence is linked to the political life of Ramses II. Here we are in a part of the temple that was covered. The temple also had open areas, such as the courtyards and the first two courtyards of the Ramesseum. Here we are entering the temple's most private area. The closer we get to the rooms leading to the sanctuary, the less people could access this part of the temple. Here we have a Hippo-style hall that was almost wholly preserved. It is extraordinary to see these capitals and these very elegant umbrellas. The quality of this architecture is quite beautiful for the Ramesside period. This big Hippo-style hall brings to mind a papyrus forest. This room gave access to a series of other, smaller halls that were also Hippo-styles. There were 3 others that followed in a row. The Saint of Saints, the sanctuary, was all the way in the back. This elevated building has completely disappeared, and the sanctuary itself was flanked by a group of side chapels. Here we are at the heart of the temple, where all the liturgies, worship, ceremonies, and services took place. There were daily services. We know that the offering tables had to be provided for many times a day. There was a staff of priests who managed these constructions from the reign of Ramses II until the end of the Ramesside period. That is, until the time the Ramesseum was abandoned. We know that this edifice was abandoned in the Third Intermediary Period, around the year 1000 BC. It was first looted and then abandoned. Later, Theban priests recuperated the temple and used it for other purposes. We know that from then on, the Ramesseum became a vast necropolis devoted to Amon's lower personnel at Karnak. It was most notably devoted to priests and officiants who could choose their burial plots and were buried there. The decree of Theodosius closed down the temples and initiated a war against paganism. The royal colossi, the statues, the great Assyrian figures that were in the first and second courtyard were probably destroyed during this time. The heads of these statues were nearly entirely cut off, and the walls were thoroughly hammered. As we make our way within the temple, we see that many royal and godly portraits of princes have been hammered. This destruction occurred during Christian times, perhaps even during the era which preceded it. During this period, images were destroyed simply because they wielded power. The Coptics were themselves Egyptians. In pharaonic times, images held a very important role. In drawing an image on these columns or on these walls, the sculptor breathed life into the image. These images wielded power, and it is precisely this power that they wanted to destroy during Christian times. The active parts of the images were to be destroyed. That is why they most often targeted the faces, hands, arms, feet, and legs. All are bodily parts that are considered active. In destroying these body parts, they destroyed the magical and negative powers of these images. These royal constructions were in use until the end of the Ramesside period, until the collapse of the institution of the royalty. Around the end of the 20th dynasty, the royal tombs in Thebes are looted, and the existing power structure disappeared. That is when the priests of Ammon ascended the throne. These great royal foundations no longer had any reason to be there, since royalty was no longer worshipped. So the priests took over these buildings and pretty much did what they pleased. We know that in the case of the Ramesseum, the site was rearranged to become a huge sacerdotal necropolis. Priests and their families were buried here, not only within a part of the temple, but also in the stores and on the processional pathways. There's an entire group of burial plots that we have to take into consideration in the context of our excavations. When you're in charge of such a site, you have to act very wisely. It is not about reassembling everything. First off, there are many stages. The first one is the archaeological dig. We dig the site to see what information it can give us, and then we determine if and how we can reestablish the site. We are dealing with two aspects here. The stone monument, the temple itself, and the adobe complex of economic buildings. So the materials themselves differ, and often only the flooring and foundations of the walls and gates remain. It's not about reassembling the entire edifice. That is impossible. It cannot be done. We can only indicate or suggest how it was built, according to the foundations. The restorative work has to maintain room for modification. The restoration is not definitive. If in 20 or 50 years archaeologists believe we did something wrong, they will always have the possibility to change it. It is imperative that the restoration be reversible. That's essential. On this site, over the years, we've uncovered a number of quarters in the Ramesseums, such as the kitchens, the bakeries, the administrative offices, the workshops, the temple school. We already knew about the school through the tomb of Amenuasu, who was the scribe of Ans, in other words, scribe to the House of Life. The House of Life was a scholarly institution in ancient Egypt. At the height of its glory, this royal foundation was managed by a staff of administrators, servants, and priests. 3,000 Theban families obtained a living from this building.
3000 familles de Thèbes de pouvoir vivre.
This illustrates the impact that these royal buildings had on the population that was at the king's service. A huge forecourt was attached to this monument, and there was a loading dock with portuary constructions that gave out onto the Nile through a canal. There were magnificent gardens around the structure. We even have information about the director of the Ramesseum's gardens. And there were processional pathways surrounding the edifice on 3 sides. This is truly unique for this edifice. This design is really incredible and very interesting, because no other Egyptian temple displays this type of construction. The processional pathways surrounding the Ramesseum were most likely used for the great celebrations of Aben. These celebrations were held in honor of both the god Amon and the reigning king, that is Ramses II. They enabled the people to bypass the temple before heading to the famous sacred sanctuary of Djem that was on the left bank. That is where the famous primordial hill stood. According to Theban theologians, the world came into being here. As we can see, the history of the Ramesseum can be pieced together bit by bit after each mission. But the restoration will not make up for the loss of holy images, nor for the loss of statues or stones. Archaeologists are naturally concerned with the restitution of stolen or displaced treasures, even if the looters and museums of the Western world had the best of intentions in displacing the treasures. There's also the creation of what later became our famous museums. Interesting events occurred in 1815 to 1816. In Egypt at the time, there was what we call the War of Consuls. Bernardino de Ravetti was the general counsel to France, and Henry Salt represented the British. At this time, the great collections of the Western world were being created, particularly the French and British collections. These consuls called on agents who scoured the country to identify the most beautiful archaeological remains, those that would likely become centerpieces of the museum. In 1816, at the request of Salt, a man named Belzoni visited the Ramesseum. His mission was to take the bust of a statue that was in the temple's second courtyard. At the time, the statue was believed to be that of Memnon. Belzoni undertook this operation in July of 1816. He took this beautiful colossus from the Ramesseum, put it on a boat to Alexandria, and from Alexandria it was sent to England. And today the statue of Memnon is on display at the British Museum. It is one of the museum's centerpieces. Because Egypt is today fully aware of having been deprived of its priceless treasures, it has launched a diplomatic battle. Egypt has requested that its historical objects be returned to their native country. But the request is left unanswered because these pieces are worth a fortune. Western museums do not want to give them up, though there have been a few exceptions.